it's very rare. I actually don't know if we're going to leave that on or not, because you really should issue work orders to get things installed. But that date would work as this box here works, where I can pick a funding source, and it'll take all blank funding sources and send them to that funding source. What this will do is it'll take all blank install dates, anything that's on the priority auto list that's blank for an install date, and it'll put an install date on it for you. It'll force it to be installed. And it's kind of only a thing you might want to do. If you do that, it eliminates being able to track things back through the work order process. It's useful during transition, because there may be periods where you're just putting things on the system, and crews and vendors are already doing work for you, but you've never issued a work order from this system for it. So rather than having to go out and issue a dummy work order and all that stuff, you would just be able to declare that the measure was installed. And all this lets you do is declare it for a bunch of them at the same time. So if I had a bunch of blank measures here, I could in fact force them to have an install date by putting a date in here and saving it. Then every blank date would get that date as an installation date.
Mm-hmm.
You can put the funding sources in as you put in the measure. You can put the funding source in at any time, and it just has to be put in before you try to bill or report out the job to the state. But you can put the funding source in at any time. So as you added the measures, I could have put in the funding source. As I added these measures in, I was already able to put the funding source in at that point. But you have to have, for a job to be considered complete, it has to have a funding source and a date for every measure. That's one of the key things for a job to be considered complete. And you can only report out complete jobs. Yes, ma'am.
On the funding source on that, sometimes we, on one thing like that, replace oil tank.
You can split the funding.
That's what I was just
Yes,
fixing to ask you.
you can
Sometimes
split
we
the funding.
split it. So how would you do that?
The version of the software, I don't have the update turned on in this training system.
Mm-hmm.
There's a switch I've got to turn on. What you'll get is right here, instead of an arrow, down arrow here, you'll get an ellipsis. It'll be 3 little dots. When you click on that, it will let you pick the funding source and either the quantity, if it's like this, the quantity you want to charge to that funding source, or the dollars you want to charge to that funding source. And you can pick from any of the funding sources. So instead of just a pull-down list of funding sources like you get here, you click on that and you get a little menu where you can choose the different funding sources. And you can split the job between the funding sources either by dollar value, so on this thing right here we could put $100 against one funding source and $100 against the other funding source. Or you could put, on something like this, you could put 5 on one funding source and 4 on the other.
So if you were to split it, if you were to put 5 on one, would a line
yes.
open up down at the
It'll
bottom?
pop up and you'll see that you'll have two.
Gotcha.
The measure will kind of get duplicated.
Okay.
But the system will recognize it's the same measure under a split funding source. And I didn't realize that when I set the system up for this training that you did split funding of a particular measure, or I would have turned it on the demo, on the training system.
Okay.
But it's off of this screen here, and it's the exact same screen, and what you'll see is when we turn it on, instead of the arrow here, you're going to get a set of ellipses next to the field, and that'll cause a little pop-up window. Much like the pop-up window that appeared when we did the income, and when I wanted to put the checks in, I clicked on the ellipse and it popped up that little window and I could put the different check values in. It's the exact same mechanism. So, all in all right now, so this job basically, since we've set all the funding sources, and I'll make sure I save that, and we have everything set up on the job. we're actually ready to now report this job out to the state. So why don't we take about a 5-minute break, and then we'll go back and make sure everybody's clear on work orders, and then we can start going through invoicing. With the work order associated with it. And I'm sitting here with this work order. It went out to a crew. Normally this might be a vendor rather than a crew, but it went out to a vendor. It's at the installation, and I'm ready to, I've sent out the inspector to do the inspection, and when the inspector comes back, I've looked at this particular replacement, and I said, you know, it's a silly replacement, but CFL. Normally what you do is if it was the wrong number or something, you just change the number and go ahead and pass it. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to fail this particular work order. So the inspector's gone on, and normally this would be some kind of actual weatherization work or something like that. I just picked compact fluorescent lights because it was easy for me to pick at the time. But the idea is if I fail this work order, then I set a date here, and I try to save this. It's not going to let me save it because it says you can't save a failed work order without issuing a callback work order to call the vendor back to correct the error. So it's going to automatically issue the callback work order to have the vendor fix it for you. So in reality, this would normally be a much more complex work order than just putting in a couple of CFLs. But the idea is the same. The inspector goes out on site and sees something dramatically wrong. So you paid a vendor to replace an oil tank for $400, and you go there and they never replaced the tank, or they replaced it with a used tank and they were supposed to use a new tank, or there was some reason that the inspector said, okay, this work has to be redone. It's not acceptable. I won't accept this. It's not just I got to change a quantity or I got to change a dollar amount. It's the work is unacceptable and needs to be redone. In that case, the status is failed. You fail it. And if you pick fail for any measure on a work order, once you pick fail, you cannot save the work order with a failed status without first issuing a callback work order. So what it's telling me here is I can't click on the save button to save this. I have to click on the issue callback work order button. So in other words, it's telling me instead of using the save button, I do this. When I do that, it will save the record, but it also generates a new work order with the item on it. The point is that this item won't re-invoice. It won't get rebilled. This is a correcting item, so it won't show up on an invoice to the state, and you shouldn't be paying for it. This should be, the vendor has to go out and fix it, so you shouldn't really be paying anything for it. So it'll come up, it'll look kind of like that, but it will be a, and you have to assign it, and you generally would assign it to the same crew that did it in the first place, but you technically could assign it to a different crew or a different vendor. If you thought the vendor had done a bad enough job that you wanted a different vendor to go in and correct it, you could actually do that. And then issue it to a different vendor. But normally you would issue it back to the same vendor and you just save it. And you now have a work order for another work order for job 100, excuse me. My job here. I guess I need to say R100.